Time to set up some forms. So I'm actually just going to start here with our sign up form. And the first thing that I'm going to do is just create a little bit of distance between the top bar and the input elements. And so I'm going to add one of our trusty 8-point grid sizes here, 24 pixels, just to create some breathing room. And then within group form, right, our inputs are right up hard against the side of the view here. I actually want to add 16 pixels on each side, which is the standard padding on a mobile between the edge of the viewport and elements. And then let's add some input labels. It's always a good idea to use input labels rather than rely on placeholder text for telling the user what the input is meant to be for. Because as soon as they start typing something here, of course, then the placeholder text will disappear and they may lose sight or lose context of what that input is meant to be for if you don't have a separate email. So that's a generally accepted best practice from a user experience, or what we call a UX perspective. And then the other thing that I'll do is just get rid of this minimum height. You can see that it's quite large there, much larger than it needs to be. And when we get rid of it, it's going to sit nice and close to the input, which is what we want. But I want to do the same thing for my input password, give it a little input as well. And so what I usually like to do is if I hold down Shift here with one element selected and then select another element, what you can do either here within the elements tree or over here on the canvas is just right click and group those elements in a column. And this can just be our group input. And if we forget about our input password for the moment, and I get rid of this silly placeholder text, what I can do if I select this group input now is if I just hit Command or Control D on my keyboard, or alternatively right click either here or in the elements tree and just paste again in the form, then we're just going to get a duplicate that we can modify for our purposes. So this is going to be password. And then to give a little bit of breathing room between these inputs, because they're very, very close together, I'm going to select my group form, come over to the layout section and just add some gap spacing. 16 pixels will suffice there. And that's going to make our form look nicely balanced. The labels are nice and close to the inputs that they correspond to, and we've got some breathing room between the different inputs. And then our sign up button also needs a little bit of space around the edges of itself and the page. And I'm just going to add 16 pixels of margin on either side here. We're not going to apply padding because that actually applies within the interior of the button. You can see this little darkened area is the padding that's applied to the button, which isn't even relevant where the sign up button is stretching the width of the page. If we turned on fit width to content, then of course it would become relevant because that padding would be between the text label of the button and the exterior border of the button itself. But we're going to have our button be in stretch mode, as we've been calling it. And then we can test this in web preview, but always a good idea to have a look on Bubble Go as well, especially for design related things. And one thing I want to draw your attention to here is the fact that our sign up button has a little bit of space between the bottom border and the bottom of the device, or the bottom of the viewport. Now that's actually because of a setting that is set on our sign up view itself. If we go and look in the appearance tab, we have this checkbox here for show safe area, right? That will actually include a little bit of a bottom gutter, if you will, that's going to prevent the content in our app's interface from overlaying with this bottom notch bar of the device. If we toggle that off, then you see that our sign up button on the canvas just got shunted right to the bottom of the viewport. And in run mode for our application, again, our button is right up there against the bottom. So unless you've got a specific design in mind, like the Snapchat sign up page, for example, where the sign up button is taking up that whole bottom section, we generally want to leave that safe area toggled on. And then we also want to add some lightweight form validation here, which is just a fancy way of saying that we want to force the user to add their content in a particular format, like an email address for the email, rather than them just typing, something arbitrary, which of course is not a valid email address. And then for the password input, we want them to not see what they are typing on the screen, right? We instead want it to be hidden as they type. So when we have our inputs selected, and let's make sure that we're naming them correctly while we're here as well, we have this content format. We did see this briefly earlier where we set a input to a currency format. So one of the things that we can set this to is an email. That's going to force the user to add their value as an email address. And the other one that we can set this to is a password. If I type in a valid email formatted bit of text here, then things are just going to behave like normal. But if this is not formatted like an email, like if I get rid of this @ symbol, you see here how the input has this red highlighting around it, in contrast to the orange, which is our app color. This red here is actually a product of this style for the input, if we go and have a look at it, actually having a conditional statement attached. So conditional statements we saw briefly in the context of our tab bar, and we're going to explore them more later, but you can see that we do have this built-in conditional statement, which is adding this border color whenever the input isn't valid. We could actually make this a little bit more obvious by perhaps adding a background color as well, so that until I add something that's valid, we get this background color, but that will go away, of course, if I type a valid email address. And then the password behavior won't actually show up here on my recording of my iPhone, but you can see it in action here in the web preview. We're going to hide the characters that the user types as they're typing. And then the final thing that we're going to do here is just add an action to navigate the user off of this sign up form. We're going to come back in a subsequent lesson and add the logic for signing users up. That is a topic that we will deal with in its own right. But for now, we're just going to add a navigation action, which is just going to go to that trips tab, which just makes our life a little bit easier. For now, while we're testing, I can just go straight through to the trips tab, and we can now start to configure and test this create trip modal. Now I want to start in a similar way that we did on our sign up form, which is putting the two elements that we do currently have, an input label and an input, inside of a group. And we'll also get rid of the minimum height here for the label. And then I'm just going to put this group itself, which is just a group holding an input, I'm going to put this group itself inside of another group, which is going to hold all of our form elements. You see, all of our form elements. Because if I now hit Command or Control D on my keyboard a few times, I'm going to create a whole bunch of input groups all inside of this group form, where now I can collectively add some top margin between those form elements and my app bar, and a little bit of padding as well. Of course, we want to add some gap spacing for each of these. And then each of these input labels should reflect what we want to collect here from the user. So this one will be the start date. We'll have an end date as well, which we're actually going to experiment and show that we can collect just optionally. It's not something the user is going to have to provide. Same thing for the cost. And then finally, we're going to have a summary field. And then for each of these, I'm just going to replace the input with the corresponding input that we need, the corresponding input type. So for start date, for example, I'm going to delete this input title that we copied and instead use this date time picker, which we briefly saw earlier on in the course. And I'm going to turn off fixed width here because I do want it to stretch the full width, give the user a little bit more space to click. And we'll set the fixed height here to match the height of our input title, which is 44. This is a good conventional size for inputs to give the user enough space to tap on them. You can go a little bit smaller, like 40 as well, but we'll stick with 44. And then this date time picker, we will rename as start date. Then if we want to test this in Bubblegome, yes, we will have to cycle through a couple of views here, but then we can open up our modal. And we can see how the date time picker looks here. And that accent color there is a little hard to see for me. So I'm going to select here something lighter, like probably this lightest gray that we have, which if we have a look, looks a lot easier to see. And then to get our end date input set up, I'm just going to delete this input that we copied across earlier. And I'm just going to copy either here in the context menu, which you can access by right clicking, or just with my standard keyboard shortcuts, Command or Control C, and then Command or Control V. And this will be our date time picker end date. And then we've got our cost input, which warrants being renamed. And we'll set the content format here to be a currency. And we'll just add a little placeholder here because there's a current limitation, as I mentioned earlier in the course, with this currency formatted input not showing the currency prefix properly. And then finally for the summary section, we're actually not going to use an input here because an input, like this title here, it's only really good for short bits of text, and it's just going to scroll horizontally if you go further than that, which isn't a great UX or user experience. So what I'm going to do is delete that input and actually use here something called a multi-line input. And if I click that and put that inside of my summary group and make this my multi-line input summary, then when we test this out, you can see that as I type, I can add new line breaks and the input will expand in height to accommodate what I am typing. And then we also need a button to create this trip. And so what I could of course do is just grab a button, put that onto the page and call it a day, but you may be able to guess what the issue is going to be here, which is that as this summary field gets longer, or maybe we want to add more inputs to this form later on, I have to scroll to the bottom here in order to see the button. Also, it's just nice to have a button floating here at the bottom from a UX perspective, because that's the closest place to the user's thumb. So we're actually going to add a floating button like we did earlier on in the course. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new floating group to the page. And this is going to be called my floating group button. I'm going to set it to float at the bottom. I'm going to find my button in the elements tree here, and I'm going to drag it up inside of the floating group, or I could just copy and paste it. That would work as well, or cut and paste it. And then with this floating group, let's get rid of the fixed width. Let's get rid of the minimum height. Also, the minimum width isn't really necessary. And because this is a floating group, the safe area doesn't apply. So if I select here, create trip, that bottom safe area, it's only going to apply to elements that are here within the layers section of the elements tree, not to any floating groups. Which means that I should add my own padding here. So I'm actually going to add a little bit of padding at the top and bottom, and of course, let's add 16 pixels on either side as well. Which is going to mean that it doesn't really matter how much content I add here. My floating button will stay there at the bottom of the page. And then what we can add to this button is a workflow to create that trip. So we'll use that same action that we saw earlier in the course where we're going to create a new trip, and then we can set all of the fields. And so we can save ourselves some time. We can always hit here, add all fields, and then just map these fields to the corresponding input values. This is where it becomes important that you label your inputs correctly, because it makes it a lot easier to find them later on. And then as we're going through here, we of course need a couple of other fields. We need to have a field to store our end date and our summary. And so what we could of course do is go back into our data tab, open up our trip, and just add a new field here. So I could add a new field for the end date, of course, which would be a date type thing. Or as a little shortcut, just within this action itself, we can actually just click here to create a new field. So I can add here the other one, which is a summary type field. And that is of type text as well. So we'll set that to be our multi-line input. And then our new end date field should of course be mapped to that date time picker end dates value. And then once we've created the trip, we can hide the modal by adding that same action that we added to our close button, which was go to the previous mobile view. And so now I can type something, add a start date, end date, some cost, some summary, hit create trip, and I think it's appearing down the bottom there. There it is. There is the trip that we just created, test. Now I want to just quickly draw your attention to one setting on our floating group, which is this move with keyboard. You might have noticed that very smoothly when we focused an input, so when the user taps on an input, the create trip button here is tethered seemingly to the top of the keyboard. And when the keyboard goes away, that floating group goes back to the bottom of the view. That behavior is enabled by this move with keyboard. If we turn that off, then when we select an input, the keyboard will just move above the top of that floating group and hide it altogether. So we obviously want to leave that on. And then the other thing that I want to draw your attention to is this safe area behavior. So what this will do is it will add essentially some extra padding either to the entire floating group or just to the elements like this button inside of the floating group. So if we set this to apply to container, what that will mean is that the floating group here has just a little bit of extra padding down the bottom, but that padding is applying around the floating group. So this is the floating group here, and that safe area, which is essentially acting as some extra padding, is this little area down the bottom. And one of the implications of that is that, let's say that our form here has a lot more content on it, and I'm gonna replicate that by just adding a lot of content to our summary here. So the summary is gonna get really long on the page. So long, in fact, that when we click out of it and our floating group is back where it should be, if I actually scroll up the page here, you can see that down the bottom, the content of that input is appearing below the button. And that's because we've got this safe area being applied, which is effectively pushing the floating group here up. So instead, what we might want to do is not apply this to the entire floating group, but actually apply it just to the children, which means that the bottom of this floating group is still going to be flush with the bottom of the user's screen. And because it has a flat white background color, that means that, again, if I've got content on my form which is going to go below the floating group, you can see that it's just hidden there behind the white of this group. And if we've got the setting applied, we probably don't also need to have some bottom padding on our floating group, since the padding is going to be applied effectively by this safe area behavior setting. And then finally, it is possible for a user to just hit create trip here and just create an empty trip. There it is at the bottom. And actually, just so we can see our test trips a little easier without having to scroll all the way to the bottom, I'm just going to amend the data source for our vertical list of trips here and actually just add some sorting. We're going to sort these by the created date, and to have the most recently created appear at the top, I'm going to set this descending value to yes. The way to think about this is that the dates that are the most into the future, which is usually the most recently created, are the highest dates. Dates that are further back in the past are lower or smaller dates. And so if we're descending, we're going to start with the greater, higher, biggest dates, and then descend down to the lower dates that are further back in the past. And so if I add a new test here, then this should appear at the top, and it does. At any rate, that's just an aside. What we came here to do was to figure out how we prevent the user from creating empty trips. Or really, we want them to have given a title and a start date for them to be able to create a trip. And so what we can do is simply, for the inputs that we want to require some value, is just tick this guy. This input should not be empty. So I'll do that for the input title, and I will do that for the start date. And so what that means is that my create trip button here is faded out. It's disabled. And if I try to click it, then the inputs that are required will become focused and also show that is not valid state. So if I just add some silly values for both of these, then you see that that create trip button is no longer faded, and I can hit it to be able to create my trip. And again, you may be able to guess that that disabled look, it's actually defined within the style for this button. So under the conditional tab, we have a setting here that when this button isn't clickable, we're going to set the opacity of the button to 25%. That's the degree that this element is visible. So it's going to add a bunch of transparency to the button in essence. And so there's this built-in relationship in Bubble between inputs that have this setting applied and any buttons where there are workflows attached to those buttons, which include actions dependent on those required inputs. So Bubble is handling this required disabled functionality user experience on our behalf. And then the last thing here is, let's say that I have a trip that starts on the 1st of May. Should I be able to add an end date that is in April? Probably not, right? Doesn't really make sense. And we can make our user's life a little bit easier as well by, on this date picker for the end date, just adding in a minimum date value, which is actually going to be a dynamic expression pointing to the value of the start date picker. Okay, so this is another way in which we can use dynamic expressions to create this kind of interactive, intelligent behavior in our apps. And so now if I test this, if I add a start date of, let's say, the 15th of May, and then try to add an end date, you'll see that the end date picker has everything below the 15th blurred out. Okay, so we've got our create trip form set up. We've got our sign up form set up. So the next logical thing is for us to add logic for signing users up to our application, which is going to form the foundation for a whole bunch of stuff, namely in our app, the ability for users to only view and edit trips that are created by them.